Russell, I'm one of the American Studies teachers here. The way these things will go, each of these sessions will be 20, 30 minutes, depending on, some people go a little longer. I don't feel the need to just read stuff off the sheet to you here. I kind of want to hit the high points here and make sure you have sort of a kind of a refresher on some of this stuff that we haven't talked about in your classes since August. Okay, so let's just jump right in here. We talk about this in terms of the AP exam, and I'm gonna camp on some places where historically the College Board really likes to spend. They like to focus on things like the First Great Awakening and Massachusetts Bay Colony and some of those things. I know some of you are looking at me like that. But those are things to kind of review. These sheets are really very good. These should be the basis for your review notes. But again, you won't get many questions. That's why we put so little time in here about anything before the British colonies. Realistically, for whatever reason, the College Board feels like American history begins in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown. And so, a cursory knowledge of Spain, France, and Portugal, and all the other countries that are colonizing in what will eventually become the United States of America. That's important, and they may ask you a question or two about the Enlightenment and those kinds of things. Generally, you get that. Where they really feel like, I think, where you really often see the story really taking off is in traditionally it's kind of where we started history. It's where we started when I was studying history. You start with the founding of Jamestown Colony, and John Smith and Pocahontas and all those things that sort of Disney version of history that are really kind of only secondarily important to Jamestown Colony. That's all within the first 2 or 3 years of that colony, where most people are starving to death or dying from malaria because they decided to start a colony in a swamp because they thought they could mine for gold there, but somebody didn't explain geology to them. Gold in swamps, right? It was a catastrophically stupid place to place that colony. If we're going to be honest, the thing that saves it is in 1610, John Rolfe, who will become Pocahontas' husband, if you know that aspect of the story, introduces tobacco into Jamestown Colony. Jamestown's in Virginia. It's a coastal region. It's got a perfect climate for tobacco. Right, which only really grows in warm weather climates. And so when he does that, that becomes the cash crop for Jamestown and then the larger Virginia colony, and for a time most of the southern colonies until cotton and those sort of things start to come along. So those important moments from the early history of Jamestown, tobacco in 1610, how that becomes this sort of the first real cash crop on the North American continent, and sort of how it turns all of Europe into smokers, including the Pope at the time loved a Virginia cigar apparently. Amen. So you get that a few years later in 1619. You get two very important pieces of American history that kind of emerge in 1619 in Virginia. It's sort of there's kind of this irony. In 1619, they formed the Virginia House of Burgesses, which will become the first elected representative body in what will eventually become the first 13 states. Right? It's also the year that they introduced African slavery to Virginia Colony, not our finest moment as a people. They had, the indentured servitude will continue to be a thing, and the headright system and all of that, but it will rapidly die because slavery was cheaper. It was cheap, you don't have to give land to a slave because they're never free. And so it will begin the process of the codification of slavery. There are different rules for it at first, and different places have different ways slavery will work. But by the 1700s, we pretty much decided, which colonies are going to have slavery, which aren't, and the way the rules of slavery will work. It's the creation of this, like any other social institution, as evil and sinful and vile as it was, there was an evolution of it, the way it worked. So those are the things that you really kind of need here. Some of these other things they talk about the formation of the colonies for different reasons. The British colonies are always a reaction to what's happening in Great Britain. You know, the Massachusetts Bay colonies; those are, you know, in the Massachusetts Bay area. They're seeking religious freedom, right? They're looking for economic opportunity when they come to Virginia. They don't know what to do with all these people in debtor's prison in Great Britain when they form Georgia. Right? Land runs out in South Carolina and Virginia, so North Carolina becomes a thing. It's always a reaction to that, to what's going on. That having been said, life in the colonies is typically better for the average person than it would be for the average person still living in Great Britain at that time, especially if you lived in the New England area. On average, your life expectancy rate would be longer. You would be less likely to lose your children in childhood to diseases where there's no medicine, and those sorts of things. So it creates. So there is a better condition of life for people who could come here. That was really good if you were white and not being drugged here against your will. Okay, so there is some of that. There's also the colonial period. The other big piece of that early colonial period that we are creating is the fundamental disagreement, I suppose, in all of American history. This thing that we still fight about politically, and that's what are we even doing here? What's the purpose of our society, right? In the New England colonies, when the New England settlers come, they bring their wives, they bring their children, they bring their religion. They come prepared to build towns and to settle in and create a civilization. And they engineer a society around faith and around family and sort of, you know, and organized towns, and this sort of thought given to, hey, we're here permanently. This is where we're going to put down roots, and we're going to stay. The southern colonies, especially Virginia at first, are founded as money-making ventures. Virginia colony is founded by the Royal Virginia Company of London, the sort of the forerunner of modern corporations. So they're here to make money. That's what those cash crop southern colonies are about. Right? South Carolina, places like that where slavery takes hold, it's because that they're producing really valuable cash crop commodities. And so the thought for infrastructure and society and the long term is not as immediate. It's that struggle between, you know, society and the good of the community versus the entrepreneurial drive of the individual, and how do we find that balance, right? All of that you can see, and all of that is created right there in the colonies. You can trace all of that to there. Those distinctions and those differences of opinions that we have about those things that we still sort of argue about. Now, I will argue, and I'm all the way on to the back here because I've skipped over some of these. I'm not skipping it because it's unimportant, but I'm skipping it because I'm skipping over it because there's dates and stuff there. You need to probably know those things, and I don't think it's a good use of your time to sort of just sort of regurgitate things at you. I will argue, though, that America, if you will, what is unique about us, actually happens in the middle colonies. If you think about it, you got the New England colonies up here, and they're doing this thing, but they, you know, and they do a lot of remarkable things. They give us the idea of universal public education and organization of community in a really purposeful way, and all those things come from the Puritans. They get a bad rap sometimes, right? But they can also be a little square, right? A little bit kind of set in their ways and pretty intolerant of anybody who doesn't fit their model. In the southern colonies, you've got this drive for you know, market success, we'll call it, this entrepreneurship, you know, as sort of ugly as the business model could be, is sort of like what's happening. The middle colonies, though, is where people get clever. It's where those ideas start to mingle. So it's New York and New Jersey and Delaware and those places where you really kind of start to see America happening. Right? Real entrepreneurship doesn't happen in South Carolina when you've got slaves picking rice and indigo and things like that. It happens in New York, where they figure out a way to sell commodities to everybody else. So the middle colonies, they sort of look at this and says, well, the New Englanders, they've got their nice little organized town, but they've also got these crappy winters and short growing seasons, they can't really feed themselves very effectively. And these southern colonies, they're all farmers, but they can't feed themselves either. That's always the irony of those southern colonies, and then later the southern states, is that they're societies of farmers who don't produce enough food to feed themselves because everything is given over to cash crop farming. Right? So the middle colonies say, there's a real opportunity for us. That's why we call them the breadbasket colonies. This is wheat and corn and rye and all these and consumable goods. This is who they feed everybody. And then of course New York becomes like it's a great natural deep water harbor, so it becomes sort of a trade port. We're exporting all this excess grain and stuff that we're feeding to everybody to all the other colonies and back to the old world, and we're doing all this and all these new and trade goods and finished goods and stuff and things from Europe and around the world are coming in there. So it's to New York that trade really kind of starts to happen, to Manhattan Island especially. Okay? There's a reason that Wall Street today, is the Manhattan borough of New York City. The most valuable real estate anywhere on planet Earth are the 22 square miles of Manhattan Island. It's the economic center of the world. And that will begin in this colonial period because they're like, hey, I guess we could, you guys need stuff, you need to harvest this thing down here, but you need farm goods. Well, we'll sell you the farm goods. It's like when people go west for the California gold rush in the 1840s. It's not the people trying to dig gold to get rich. It's the people who sell them the shovels. Being smart, that's entrepreneurship. That's American ingenuity, right? If we're going to be honest about what this is, you see a need and the market responds. That's free market capitalism, so you see that settling in, that idea long before we put a name to it. We don't put a name to the free market, really. We don't. And Adam Smith will write The Wealth of Nations in 1776. It coincides with our revolution by coincidence, but the ideas of that are really taking root in the United States, in colonial America. And we're doing all of this for most of this colonial period without the British being involved at all. There's this long period that we refer to as salutary neglect. Okay, that's that phrase that people use. Like, what does that mean? That the British don't care what's happening in the colonies, right? They get some raw materials from here. That the British are the man for man, the finest sailors in the world. But sailors, because they're just a big island. But they've cut all the trees off of their island by the 1600s, building big wooden battle fleets. So they need new sources of timber. Well, New England oak is the best in the world for building those big wooden sailing ships that they used back then. So they've got timber, and they've got excess food stuffs, and they've got natural markets now for finished goods. It's great. It's a good system. And if we occasionally start some kind of skirmish, or we're kind of get out of hand or whatever, we'll let the local authorities deal with it. There's really no need to involve the British government. So for a period of almost 150 years, right up until really the French and Indian War, which is a little before, which is kind of right where this period ends, that's really kind of part of the revolution, if you're going to be honest about it. They had engaged in this practice of salutary neglect, meaning that they just left us alone. It'd be like being parents who had basically a good kid. You kind of leave them alone. They kind of do their own thing. They don't get in any trouble. We weren't, for the most part, we weren't. But while that's happening, because they're not involving themselves with us, we're creating our own culture, and we start to do our own thing here. And the colonies initially start to see themselves. Massachusetts is distinctly different than South Carolina, and that won't change overnight. And they won't start to see themselves as Americans, as part of some entity, until much later into this colonial period. And that starts to turn with the last thing that we have listed on here, and that's the First Great Awakening. You cannot undervalue the importance of the First Great Awakening for creating a sense of American unity. In the 1730s, revivalist ministers start talking about, people, now we've had these colonies, especially in New England, where they found these religious societies. And they've been doing it for a long time. They've been kind of doing that for a long time. But subsequent generations have been born, and times change, and people become kind of more secular and less religious, and there kind of starts to be this feeling that there needs to be more connection with God. And we'll have these kind of phases in American history. There's a First Great Awakening and a Second Great Awakening and a fundamentalist movement in the 1920s. About every 100 years, we feel like we need to do this. Right? People kind of we gotta go back to the old ways. We gotta reconnect with our traditional religious values. 1730s preachers like Jonathan Edwards and those guys, sinners in the hands of an angry God and all that stuff. They start telling people to kind of go back to your roots, and kind of really stressing the idea of a personal relationship with the deity, like really refining that, right? And on a religious level, that's one thing, but this coincides with the American Enlightenment, with the Enlightenment coming to our shores, which also says that individuals have value. Right? Your natural rights are yours because you, as an individual, have expressed liberty. You are created as an entity with value. That's a heady kind of brew of things. That God creates you. You put those two things together. God creates you as an individual of worth. It's not just what we create collectively, but you individually matter. And it creates this language and these circuit ministers during the First Great Awakening, they would ride around, they'd ride all up and down the coast to all 13 different colonies, kind of spreading this idea. So it becomes an idea that everybody's sharing. It becomes the first American idea. This combination of the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening in their American forms. They're different here than they are in Europe. It takes on this very American, and it starts to create this American identity. Like, hey, you could read Jonathan Edwards' sermons in Massachusetts, you could read it in South Carolina, and you could get something out of it. And it kind of creates a bond of kinship. Now it does another thing. All those circuit ministers riding around. Somebody says, "Well, hey preacher, if you're going to South Carolina, would you mind taking these letters to Charleston for me?"
Oh.
And he says, "Okay, sure." And if Charleston says, "Hey, well, you're going back through Raleigh, maybe you could drop these off. If you're going to go all the way to Boston, and people so it becomes the mail service. Right? We start sharing ideas. Now this is really gonna put the screws to the British when they start trying to clamp down on us during the Revolution, because we've created mail networks by now. We can communicate with each other in a way that they can't control. Right? And that's gonna have profound impact on our ability to win our own revolution. Because we can exchange ideas like Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin sees all of this starting to happen because he's a full generation older than the other founding fathers. He witnesses all of this. And he starts publishing a little thing called Poor Richard's Almanac. Right? It was a magazine. Really, if you think about what it is, it had all kinds of little country sayings and stories and kind of philosophical writings, just kind of general interest pieces. But now people are sharing it. And that slowly becomes the basis for how newspapers kind of start being. People start writing letters to each other. We have a mail service. So in the early republic, under the presidency of Washington, the country's falling apart. We're massively in debt. Whatever. We had a mail service second to none. Because we'd always had that. Again, a carryover from the colonial period, a carryover from this Great Awakening. So it's not just this it's not just a philosophical or a religious movement. It has real, practical, tangible effects in the ability of the colonies to effectively communicate with each other. And so when they march redcoats against Boston, the news can travel very quickly, and people in South Carolina are already taking up arms. It creates that sense of, I can't stress to you how important it is understanding that. A lot of times people talk about First Great Awakening, let's talk about it philosophically and religiously, and those things are important too. I don't want to diminish that, but the practical effect of the ability to communicate, it really creates, it starts to create this American identity. Right? After we'll need a war hero in George Washington and some other things like that before we get to a revolution. But that's the first piece. If you really want to think about the 1730s and the Great Awakening, it's the first piece of the puzzle that we're going to have to put together for our own independence. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a big thing, but it's like why that matters so very much, and why you'll definitely get multiple choice questions on it. I wouldn't be surprised at all to get if you got a short answer. My best guess is it's not the DBQ because it was 3 or 4 years ago. That's the thing you have to be prepared for, is that your DBQ or those big writing components could be from this early part of American history. The last couple of years they've been very contemporary, but I would suspect you're going to get something on the First Great Awakening. I guess you just can't overvalue how important it is in changing the way this whole thing works. Okay. Questions? Okay. And that's about what I've got, guys.